If you get some zeros at the beginning of the year, you will never get an A. It's mathematically impossible. So why would I keep trying? In a competency model, what you're trying to build in is that we know you don't know how to do this yet. Totally fine. Try and fail. You're not going to be punished for those trials.
Welcome to Principal Office Hours, where we swear there's no detention slip waiting for you. Just real talk from real principals who survived everything from budget apocalypses. In this episode, we talk about competency-based learning and how it's different than traditional curriculum, both in terms of the focus and emphasis that it has for students as they go through the curriculum, but also the impact that it has on student confidence, student engagement, and the degree to which students feel like they can fail and they're allowed to fail. So how does competency-based learning create more of a growth mindset in students and also the staff that implement this approach? All this and more in today's episode. Stay tuned. She holds a master's in education from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree from UC San Diego. It's a real pleasure for me to have in our studios today Miranda Thorman. She's the executive director of East Bay Innovation Academy, or EBIA, and they're a public charter school in Oakland, California. Miranda, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about East Bay Innovation Academy, the students, the community that you serve, and what's it like leading the school out there?
Yeah. So we serve students 6th through 12th grade in Oakland, California. As a public charter school, probably most people know we can accept any kid in California. So while most of our kids live in Oakland, we also serve students in surrounding cities. One thing that I love about our community and that brought me there is we serve a really diverse population, diverse by every metric from ethnicity, language background, socioeconomic status, kind of interest level. It's a really diverse community that I think really reflects the diversity of Oakland. We have a focus around STEM education. So we're particularly focused on our science and technology courses and program. In our high school, we have a computer science and design career pathway for students that includes both coursework in computer science design as well as internships and work-based learning experiences. Our middle school has a really robust kind of science lab curriculum, and we also have an award-winning science Olympiad team at both our middle school and our high school, where our students get to compete against other schools in California, which is super fun. So a focus on that hands-on learning, exploration, and also a focus for us of really helping kids develop their next step for after high school.
Perhaps it's not really a surprise that in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're very STEM focused, very tech focused. But is there anything outside of that gave you guys that STEM focus?
Our founders were a group of parents who were interested in creating more opportunities around tech and science education in the Bay Area, that they themselves often worked in those industries. So yeah, the Bay Area is known for that. I think the piece that it's not just the science and technology education, but for us also that project-based hands-on learning. So really wanting to make sure that our classrooms are in all subjects. Students are doing the work that people do in those disciplines, are looking at real-world challenges, taking what they learn and applying it to something novel, whether that is in English class, doing interviews and doing like a humans of a EBIA kind of project, or in science, like building a a to scale version of the solar system. Life size would be really cool, but to scale.
That would be cool. Duplicate the solar system. That'll be fun. So you mentioned project-based learning earlier, and we were talking before about this idea of competency-based learning and how it's a little bit counterculture sometimes when it comes to thinking about how students need to meet certain benchmark grades and state testing and all of that. But how does this idea of project-based learning and competency-based learning play into the everyday curriculum and instruction at East Bay Innovation Academy?
Yeah. So I think the way I like to think of it is a flipped way of looking at the purpose of what kids are learning. So, as you mentioned, like in a more traditional model, kids are learning a set of assigned kind of standards, curriculum that they will then take a test to say, did you learn this thing? And the reason for the learning is you have to learn it so that you can take this test. And I think project based, competency based education is trying to flip that a little to say, the reason that you need to learn this skill, this concept, this content is so that you can do something novel, something real, something new, which I think hopefully most people can agree sounds more engaging for kids, but also like for kids to really learn, you have to create that spark, that why, that I know why I'm doing this. And I know probably all of us had experiences in school where if you ask me why I was doing it, it's because my teacher told me to and I have to do it so I get a grade. Whereas we want to flip that in a project based, competency based model to say, I know that if I need to understand these dates and specific events that happen in history so that I can bring that knowledge to this debate that I'm going to have about something happening in the world today. I can't have a thoughtful, critical thinking debate about a topic if I don't have some factual knowledge. But the reason I learn those facts is so that I can do this, not just to learn.
Got it. So the main difference sounds like it's really just having a very clear objective for the learning that is placed in front of the students that they intrinsically want to invest in, and
Mhm.
therefore create that curiosity in them to build their own learning from the materials that they have available to them. Sounds very
Mhm.
much like what the real world is, would you
Yeah,
say? I don't know.
100%. I think that when we talk to people about competency learning, and I think it's actually what we all do, right? Like when you start a new job, usually you have some foundational skills, hopefully, to do that job, but you're going to have to learn. And part of learning means that there are going to be times when you might fail or you might have more trouble. And that's also what's going to happen in the classroom. And if we have a more traditional system where it's you're going to learn this for 2 weeks and then you're going to have a test and then it's over. If you didn't learn it in those 2 weeks, you're done. Now you have a zero. Now you'll never get an A. That's not what we do in work. We like go to our new job. I know when I started out, I didn't even know how to change the ink in the coffee machine. I had to learn that and I could have failed because I failed at that the first time. I had the opportunity to learn, to get feedback, to say, okay, help me build these skills. And that happens over time. And so the real core of competency learning is that we're acknowledging that learning doesn't happen for everyone in the exact same amount of time, and that the traditional model of education assumes that all learning happens for every single child in the same way in the same amount of time. And competency learning is taking more of a real world context into account to say, let's help kids build skills in a realistic way over time. Some are going to learn them quickly and maybe are ready to move on. Some of them need more practice and more goes before it really clicks. And like you said, that's what is the reality for most of us in the workplace.
Yeah, I really like that. And I just think about the workplace today and how skills get obsolete so quickly because of technology progress. And it's not like somebody's built a robust curriculum for using generative AI, for example. Like everyone's figuring out as they go along. But the goals that we have are still the same. We're trying to solve climate change. We're trying to solve whatever. And we're now just applying knowledge of these new tools to these enduring problems that we're trying to solve.
Mhm.
Now, I want to go even to look at traditional instruction and say maybe a little bit of a straw man to say that it's that tightly codified. Like I'm even seeing like within traditional instruction some degree of personalization, some degree of a mixture of formative and summative assessments to be able to calibrate the learning of each kid, and this whole idea of multi-tiered systems of support to be able to provide that broad-based, meet each student where they're at approach to learning. So how would you say that in light of those evolutions in traditional instruction as well, like how would you say that competency-based learning differs? Is it mostly from a objective based approach rather than a curriculum based approach, or are they very similar?
I think they're similar, especially I would say just picking up on the formative summative assessment piece that you were talking about. In a competency model, you actually have more formative assessments and lots of formative assessments and lots of feedback. I think the difference in when it finally comes to calculated grade would be that those aren't graded, that the incentive to do those is the learning, and that the summative does take on more weight because that's when you're like, okay, like I've gotten all this feedback, I've applied all this feedback here, I'm going to demonstrate what I've learned. And I know for some students and parents, that turns into now my whole grade is the final or something. And that feels unfair. And I think that's, you have to go deeper into kind of undoing some of the traditional ways of thinking of school so that the summative is more, I'm going to do this when I really feel like all of these formative assessments I've done along the way have helped me either build the thing that is my summative, or I've actually done some of the steps that are going to be ultimately graded and gotten feedback on them, or I've shown through different, maybe I had a meeting with my teacher and they know like I'm ready to go do that presentation. And I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think like it's not undoing everything, but it is taking away that we're only going to assess kids through a multiple choice test. It's looking at how you design those formatives and summatives to be more like what things that we do in the world that really give kids the chance to demonstrate those competencies. And I think to a point you were making earlier, this helps with personalization because kids are really working towards specific competencies that they know they can apply beyond, your algebra class or your world history class. They're things that are going to be helping them build out a portfolio for them to take into their college work if that's where they choose to go, or their career work.
Got it. And so is it like a 0 and 1, like binary? Did CT demonstrate this competency or not? And if he did, like even during one of the formatives, it's like, all right, that box is checked. Or is it more of we have this kind of capstone project at the end of a particular period, whether it's a semester or a term, and he managed to demonstrate these competencies within the project or not. And it doesn't count if he did demonstrate these competencies before, but didn't show it in this project. Like, what's the
Yeah.
philosophy behind that?
I think that's like a debate within the world of competency. And I've seen different types of schools or programs do it differently. I think there are some that have tried to create something that is more of a checklist of usually in a full built out competency structure, there will be a scale and that is normed to grade level, but a kid doesn't necessarily have to be at their grade level, but you would say every sixth grader should about be at a 4 by the end of the year. And so there are schools that would say these are the competencies that we think are most important that are being assessed and taught in these grades, and kids need to hit a certain threshold. And once they've done that, it's okay, you're good and you're ready to move on. Some schools would say a kid has multiple opportunities to demonstrate their competency. And while I didn't see it in the summative, I know I saw it in the formative, even though that wasn't like a going in the grade book thing. I feel like they've demonstrated that mastery because I saw it here and I can feel comfortable with moving them forward. I think one of the challenges for competency-based education is that anytime you're trying to innovate within a really ingrained system, you run into those system challenges. So like in a true competency model, you wouldn't be in a grade. You would be in a school and you would be moving through competencies that could be assessed by different teachers. And you're like building out your portfolio to say, okay, I have a competency around oral presentation. And I was able to show that in both my English class and my science class. And now I've demonstrated my mastery. And I'm going to collect a different competency in another area, but I can choose. The idea that schools, and there's a lot of reasons why schools are structured this way from a sustainable run a school perspective. You have sixth graders, you have seventh graders, you have eighth graders. So undoing all of that is like undoing a lot of what we know to be school. That's why I think in the competency education world, we're often trying to fit a concept that really is like blowing up the system into a system, and then it can lose. And I feel like this is what I found in my work in trying to implement in schools is you're butt up against some of these entrenched systems, and then you have a workaround, and then that workaround lessens the impact of what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And from a just very practical perspective, I'd imagine if I'm training to be a teacher and I get certified, say I'm now certified to teach in
Right.
California, how much of that would actually be transferable to being able to lead a competency-based curriculum with
Hmm.
my kids? Or is there a whole new set of training I need to go through to get there?
That's a great question. I think to my point about structures, like there is the structure of teacher preparation that is set and would have to shift. I think, though, at the core of the teaching profession, you're still getting to know your students, building out curriculum for them. When I was in the classroom and as a history teacher, I started creating my own competency model, like within what I was doing, because I was just interested in the way I was giving kids feedback and how I was assessing them. And I was able to do that within what I knew about teaching and learning. I think you're right, though. If I'm a brand new teacher and I'm coming into the classroom and I'm being asked to think about, have my students really mastered something and what does that look like, is more challenging than I gave a test, they got a 70%, they have a 70%. So, yes, I think it would require some shifts in teacher preparation, but also any school, like the schools that I have worked at that are doing this, usually we have additional time before school starts for the newer teachers to help them. And then there's a lot of coaching around the model. I think it is, again, really when you change systems, like very daunting, and grading and assessment is often considered like a third rail for
Mm,
teachers
yeah,
because it's a lot of work that teachers put into that. And it's really hard to imagine shifting. And so I think one of the challenges with schools moving to this model is around getting the buy-in and the support and the understanding from teachers. And there are some schools, though, that this just is their model, and that's how they bring their teachers in.
got it. And if I'm understanding this correctly, you could have an identical content in the curriculum. Say, for example, we're studying the Civil War in social studies, but the approach would be different between the
Yeah.
traditional model and competency model. So you'll be covering the exact same content, but what you're looking out for from the students, what you're pushing them towards, may be quite different. Is that
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. And it goes back to that kind of flipping the reasoning of why you're learning it. So
right?
if I'm teaching about the Civil War, it might cover all the same things, but rather than assessing, did they learn about this battle or did they memorize the Gettysburg Address? I want them to understand, I'm going to be looking at their primary source analysis skills and their ability to gather evidence to form an argument. So again, same thing that you're doing, but my focus on what I'm looking for from kids is, can you take this content that you learned and show me how you can do these bigger analysis pieces rather than just show me that you learned the content. And I think a lot of schools and teachers have already been moving away. You don't have to go all the way to competency learning to think of it that way. There's been a lot of work around kids doing the work of the discipline rather than just learning facts about the discipline. I know you mentioned I
Mm.
went to Stanford, Sam Weinberg, who taught, I'm not sure if he's still there, but very long time, how to teach history. Wrote a great book about it that I wish I could name right now, thinking like a historian, I think. And so that's been in the water in education, I think, for a while. And like competency takes it a little farther to like really into like I'm assessing those skills.
Got it. So it's really creating rubrics around some of those domain-based skills that you need to have to be a good historian, to be a good mathematician, to be a good economist, or
Yeah.
whatever it may be. And on one hand, it's an easy transition because you can use the same curriculum. It can just be a vehicle for unlocking those skills within that discipline. On the
Mhm.
other hand, it's also a lot harder because now that anyone delivering this instruction now may have to pay attention to something completely different and to be able to respond to the students accordingly. And just from a teacher pipeline perspective, like where do you get your teachers from? Do some teachers come from the public school system, or is there a separate pipeline that you guys have?
That's a great question. And I'll just mention that the teacher pipeline in the Bay Area is very sparse at the moment because of the high cost of living and other factors. Having worked myself in a public district school as well as charter schools, I do think people tend to go in one or the other. So I would say the majority of people applying for positions at my school are coming from another charter school or have charter school experience. And I think they're looking for what you, the difference in a charter school is like that really tight knit community, generally speaking, a little more focus on like through advisory and like student relationships and mentorship and having that be part of your job. And I would say every charter school I've worked at has a lot more professional development days than public district schools. So people who want that growth opportunity, those learning opportunities. So I think, yes, we are looking for people who want to spend some of their time designing curriculum, don't want to just have it handed to them. And there's pros and you could do either. And so they are people who are at the end of every school year like, oh, what am I going to do differently next year? How do I want to tweak this? How do I want to build this out? And my current school, where we're exploring different competency models who are already trying those things out in their classrooms. And I would just add to something you said also about the rubrics that one way to think about competency learning is less about a rubric and more about a continuum. And this was an aha for me as a teacher, where like rubrics are saying to kids, do this thing and you get this score. Make sure you have a thesis check. You have this. And kids, they're not gaming the system exactly, but I checked your boxes. And as a teacher, I would find I had kids who did an essay that checked the boxes. They had the highest rubric, but there wasn't like any real in-depth analysis. It wasn't, they were checking the boxes. And then I would have a student who would turn in an essay. I was like, wow, I can see how their thinking has evolved. In my mind, that kid has demonstrated a higher level of mastery, but I have no way to indicate that in a rubric. So a continuum by definition is like you can go back and forth. Maybe I can show that even I'm a seventh grader, I'm like at a 10th grade level in this one area because I'm really sophisticated there. That doesn't mean I should be in 10th grade, or I'm a little below where I could be, but that's okay because I can like really see these very clear ways that I can keep improving. So I would say that's like an important distinction to think about and a reframe. Even for myself, when I started moving here, I kept saying rubric to retrain myself. Continuum, you know.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because what that means is a lot of the student's development is now in the hands of the teacher, really, because not to downplay the power of rubrics and how useful they can be, but almost like a paint by numbers way of learning, like you're checking off these boxes and you then get an A or whatever it may be. But if you're applying discretion in the grading process, you then need that discretion to be calibrated in some way, which can be tricky because your continuum might be really different from mine. Especially in the corporate world, we talk a lot about like human biases that get applied for various reasons. And when the evaluation is too left to the subjective judgment of each individual, it can sometimes go awry. But on the other hand, you want that human to be making
Yeah.
that judgment. So how do
Yeah.
you draw that balance? It's a really fine line to walk.
Yeah. And I would say I have been in many conversations about like that issue. And I would say in my time in education, which is now over 20 years, I think the shift from no rubric or anything, where kids would get a paper back and it just had a grade on the top of it, and you have no idea where that came from. And there was, you guess, but what am I supposed to do differently next time? And then, like, when I was in grad school and learning about rubrics, that they were like a little newer ish. But the point was like, kids should understand what's the expectation? How do I meet that expectation? What could I do differently? And I think rubrics came from an amazing place of let's be more transparent. It shouldn't just be this black box where the teacher is like, hey, see. So that was, I think, a very important shift that happened. And I think as that has gotten like entrenched, like I was saying, it becomes a little more box checky and doesn't really include everything. And I think for teachers, I don't know, I'm sure there's been actual research done on this. In my anecdotal sitting in rooms doing common grading, it's never the same. There's no way to take some level of bias out of, especially grading like a paper or a presentation. I think what the competency continuum does is, first of all, some competencies that are specific to disciplines, but some that are more universal, like oral presentation could happen in any class, collaboration, analytical thinking. So you can think a little more interdisciplinarily about what those things look like and calibrate. And then you're also creating like a more kind of fine-tuned tool that I would say is more student focused to give teachers more tools and then to give kids more information about it's not just that you had a thesis, you had two pieces of evidence and a conclusion that summed up your main point. You we're able to distinguish between impact, an intentional or non-intentional impact of this actor in history on this thing. So it's taking kind of standards and those skills, but putting them into a larger competency that's a little more universal. And I think also the way it's helpful for teachers is that, like you said, it's the same job. Like you're still creating curriculum. You can use the same curriculum. But at East Bay Innovation Academy this year, one thing that we've been doing is working in discipline teams. So all the history teachers taking their assignments that they've created or adapted from curriculum and then applying this competency continuum to say, what could a student achieve on this assessment based on how the assessment is written? Could they actually reach the highest level, or are they not being asked the right questions to help them get there? So it's a tool for teachers to evaluate their own curriculum or the curriculum that they're adapting, as well as then, okay, then we give the assignment and then we look at the student work and we say, okay, were the kids able to do these things? To what extent were they? Is the issue that they haven't been given the practice, or the issue that the question could be worded differently? And a lot of the times it would be really like, oh, we're not actually asking them that next level critical thinking question. We don't know if they can do it or not because we didn't even.
So all of this makes a lot of sense. And you guys do 6 through 12.
Mm.
So you're getting students that have come out of potentially public elementary schools
Yeah.
who may not have been exposed to this method of instruction. You're getting families who are also going to be new to this. Is
Mhm.
there a transition period there at 6th or 7th grade there that you pay special attention to students and families to just help them understand what you're trying to do?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's funny because it's actually a little more like elementary education, like, than most traditional secondary. So in some ways, it's a slightly easier transition because kids are used to getting more either standards-based or holistic feedback. They're not very used to take a test and get a grade. In some ways, like, the school I was the principal of made this a big transition away from a very traditional grading system to a competency system, and our 7th graders going to 8th grade had a harder time with it than the 5th graders coming into the 6th grade, which was interesting. And we do a lot of work with our families, both as they're exploring our school and also as they're onboarding as new families, to help them understand the way you're going to see your child's progress, like what you're going to see. And it's challenging. And I think one thing that's particularly challenging about thinking of competency or mastery based is that kind of by definition, you're not going to be a master when you start. That does not mean you will not be a master by the end, but like a parent who is, "Oh my god, why didn't you get a 2 out of 5?" And if you just started 6th grade, you shouldn't be at a 5. If you're at a 5 at the beginning of the year, then you either shouldn't be in 6th grade or we need to redo all of our curriculum because you're not being challenged. But, like, families and kids have a very hard time with it. So, I would say that is one area that requires a great deal of coaching. And I think the other piece of that, though, is that I think schools, like, with very good intention and teachers don't want to tell a kid, "Hey, you're really, like, not at standard." And it's pretty easy to start to, like, lower your expectation because you don't want them to feel bad. But ultimately, then that child is not being served equitably. I mean, I heard there was, like, a lawsuit somewhere of some girl who graduated from high school with all A's and got to college and couldn't read, so she's, like, suing her school district. I don't know where that is, but I think that's valid. I think that probably not that's extreme, but my former school where I was principal, my 6th grade math teacher at the first year of implementation, we were doing on a 1 to 4 kind of continuum scale. And she said, "I'm really struggling to actually give a kid a 1." But then when at the end of the year and after she looked at, like, their state testing and everything, she was like, "The ones I thought should be were a 1 if you look at all of these metrics." And that doesn't mean, should have probably given them the 1, and that's gonna need extra support, and what are they gonna need to help them move up? But I do think from a family perspective, while it might seem frustrating, you're actually getting much more accurate information about your child. And while I think a lot of parents are like, "I just want my child to get A's, I just want them to do well," I would hope that, and as a parent, at my heart, I'm like, "But I wanna know where they need support and what else they need, and actually legitimately, for real, where are they?" Not,
Mm,
"You do all your work, you get an A."
yeah.
Even though you're actually not learning at standard or grade level.
And I think this feeds in a lot into this idea of a growth mindset that you're trying to create for the students. And before I dive into that, I just one last thing on just testing,
Yeah.
because how does this focus on the competencies and on these meta skills that are being built? How do they serve the students as they have to go for standardized testing, which
Mhm.
in other environments that they might be a lot more familiar with that cadence of
Mhm.
testing and response? Do you feel like students that have not had that exposure as much and are maybe more in the competency-based learning mode, do they adapt a little bit slower or have more of a
Mhm.
hard time taking standardized testing and performing in standardized tests?
Yeah, I think first of all, the competencies must be based around standards and grade level standards, which they generally are. And so they would be just like a larger grain size than like a one single common core standard. So they must be normed and based on that. So, like I said, if it's a continuum, you still are like, this is around where this kid should be at grade level. So that has to be true. And then I would say, in terms of if we're talking about like state testing in California, the SBAC test actually has now, for both the ELA portion and the math, a performance assessment, which I think is actually much more similar to what you would get in a competency learning classroom. And in my experience, kids lack stamina often for those performance assessments. The math one, for example, usually only is 3 questions. They're just very big questions that you have to do a lot. And I've definitely had kids be like, "Oh, I finished. It was only 3 questions, 5 minutes." I'm like you definitely didn't do the test. And I think that's the work, in particular, Linda Darling Hammond, who was at Stanford when I was there, who is really involved in California education to shift the way we're assessing kids to better match what kind of should be happening in classrooms. I will say charter schools I've worked at, there's some charter schools that are more like your KIP or your like uncommon schools that are a little more test focused. I've tended to work in the ones that are a little more like project based. And I would say in those more project based schools, we've realized that we do have to prepare kids for standardized tests so that they feel confident. They do need to take sample, they need to practice the way the questions are, they need to take interim assessments. And I've now like recently had that conversation with a couple of people at different schools. And part of that is just the test prep component. I would say though, if you're really thinking about deep understanding of what you're learning, remembering what you're learning, because you're more likely to remember if you like cared about learning it in the first place, that kids might be better prepared for assessments. Again, like the SAT is a weird test that you just have to prepare for anyway. We also, most charter schools and ones I've worked at, use the NWEA MAP testing. So we're giving kids those opportunities. And a formative assessment can be a multiple choice test. I just shouldn't only be that, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It hits home for me because I'm just thinking about my own driving competencies, and I've been driving
Mm.
for 20 years. And recently I had to take a driving test again at the DMV. And I'm
Scary.
like, okay, I'm not used to that. I have the skills, but I'm gonna go have to practice.
Yeah. There's a group that I should have mentioned already that I've done a lot of work with called Building 21, and they're based in Philadelphia. And they're really doing amazing work around competency learning that they've built out in their lab schools and their learning network that I'm a part of. And one of their kind of first, if you're introducing staff to this, they do like a kind of training. And one of the first pieces of the training to think about competency learning is different videos of people riding bikes and thinking about who's most competent. And it goes everything from a toddler trying to learn how to ride a bike to like a 10-year-old riding a bike like fine down the street to a high school like BMX biker to an Olympic level, those cool bike tricks that they do. Like on some level, they're all competent for their age. But I know some 2-year-old can do those like pedal
Yeah.
things. I don't know what those are called, push bikes, whatever those are called. And like I would say that child is actually at grade level competency. And also the person who is just riding a bike proficiently, but there is somebody who is riding a bike at a way higher competency level. It doesn't matter how old you are. So I think to your point, like you can have a skill that's a proficient skill, but there are like levels of competency within.
Yeah. And going back to the growth mindset piece, how do you think that this allows students to more explore their own growth potential and to build confidence as they acquire competence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this is all about growth mindset for sure. Partly because you're a mastery system is really teaching kids, it's about the practice. It's about responding to the feedback. It's about showing growth. Like I said earlier, in a traditional grading model, if you get some zeros at the beginning of the year, you will never get an A. Like it's mathematically impossible. So like, why would I keep trying? And in a competency model, what you're trying to build in is that we know you don't know how to do this yet. Totally fine. Try and fail. It's okay. You're not going to be punished for those trials. I think that's in the ideal world. I think moving kids into that, it doesn't happen so easily. I think helping kids build growth mindset, especially in a system where they think it's like any failure is the end of the world. And I think it's a whole separate conversation, but there's a lot of being written right now about kids' massive fears of failure and risk taking going down and all of those things. And so I believe as an educator that we can get to a place of a growth mindset with something like more competency, mastery, learning, but I don't think that won't be a hard transition because I don't think it's how kids see things right now. But I think if done well, it's all about helping kids develop a growth mindset.
Got it. Now, just imagine if I were like a principal of another school
Mhm.
and having heard this episode, I'm like, I really want to be able to implement this philosophy at my school, like starting from tomorrow. And what is one thing that I could do almost immediately to be able to help my staff to be able to pay more attention to competencies, help the students develop more of this growth mindset and to nurture that? Is there one thing that I could start doing tomorrow, however small, an action that I could take?
But that's a great question. There's a lot of like chicken egg things going through my mind.
Mhm.
One is to have teachers start to look at their curriculum, what I was describing, to say, what are the bigger competencies that I'm trying to teach to students? So, like, I'm an 11th grade English teacher. Besides, I want them to read Shakespeare and I want them to do this and that. At the end of 11th grade, they should all be able to write a really amazing argumentative essay or something. So, like, how am I building out that competency? And how am I really making sure that I am giving kids a lot of feedback to help them grow and maybe even design my grade book to say, like, your first argumentative essay will ultimately get calculated into your final grade because I want you to throw it all at the wall and try, and it's okay if you fail. And I'm really going to use that to like give kids a lot of feedback. I would say that would be like a smallish thing. I would say I want to think of the name of the book, but there's a book about grading that I started with at my old school that isn't really about mastery grading. So, a book called Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, that I'm sure some people will be familiar with, was a helpful way for me as an educator and then also with my staff at the school where I was a principal to start the conversation about why our traditional model of grading is inequitable. So, some of the points I was making around if you get a zero in your first assessment, you mathematically will never be able to get an A if an A is mastery, and helped open like teachers' minds to thinking a little bit differently about assessment. It can help open up conversations about formative and summative assessments. Make sure your staff is like all on the same page. I know when I, as a principal, when we started down this road, I realized we didn't all have the same understanding of what a formative assessment is and what a summative assessment is, where I thought that we all did. And so, work that we did around understanding the purpose of those and kind of digging in to that and looking at your own kind of students' work and what you're seeing there is one way to get started. And I would also shout out the Aurora Institute, which is more of a think tank that has published lots of pieces around competency learning to read and to get information about, as well as conferences and workshops and that sort of thing.
Got it. So it sounds like it could be quite a big shift to make, but at the same time, it sounds like it's something that's worth exploring, even if we were to stick to the traditional curriculum and grading structures,
Mhm.
giving teachers, students that permission to try and fail, structuring your assessments throughout the year in a way that's not overly punitive at the beginning, and definitely checking out those resources, the Grading for
Mhm.
Equity book, anything put out by the Aurora Institute.
Mhm.
We're going to have those in our notes. It sounds like just having that mindset could already
Mhm.
make a big difference in instruction.
Yeah. And you're right. I think it's like growth mindset for kids, but also it's a mindset shift for schools and teachers and parents as well. And this is what I did as a teacher when I wanted to try this is I just played around with how I weighted things, played around with how I was doing some different feedback pieces. So I was still working within that traditional system. And I think as a teacher, I did see a shift in my students' engagement in some of the different pieces as recipients of like information that they were going to spout out to like actively engage. And also, they were doing much deeper reflections when I really pinpointed here's this competency that I want you to develop. I want you to develop the ability to see connections because to me, learning history is very much about those connections. I gave them a lot of assignments around that and some very specific reflection like, can you do this? How do you see yourself growing? Show me a piece of work that shows that. And I just saw a lot deeper engagement. And so I think that was just me as a teacher being interested in this. But I think any teacher in a classroom who is interested can implement those things within the confines of the more traditional system.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Miranda,
Yeah.
for sharing so generously today about competency-based learning and the philosophy and the practice of it, and the kind of difference that it can make to students and their ability to adopt the growth mindset. We really appreciate you sharing. And thank you for being on the show. For all of you listening, thank you for tuning in. It has been a great pleasure sharing these amazing insights from our guests with you. And I've been your host, CT. I'm signing off. And that's a wrap on today's Principal Office Hours. Before you rush off to put out the next school emergency, take 2 seconds to subscribe. It's way easier than getting your budget approved. And if you like what you heard, head over to principalofficehours.com to sign up for weekly updates on the show. Also, the best compliment would be to tell your friends about us, especially the ones who look like they need therapy or a career change. We're going to be back with fresh principal insights and inspiration every week. Until then, keep being the leader that your ID badge says that you are. See you next time.